Nathaniel Croft wanted quiet. He'd put it plainly in the notice he'd posted at the general store in Hartley Creek, Alberta. Rancher seeks capable woman. Work is hard, land is isolated. Romance not expected. References preferred but not required. He'd meant every word. What arrived on the afternoon stage was Willa Graves, 28 years old, one small trunk, a satchel she didn't let go of even when she stepped down onto the frozen mud of Main Street, and a past that was still moving. Nathaniel had been waiting outside the feed store with his collar turned up against the November wind. He'd expected someone plain, someone tired maybe, someone who wanted distance the same way he did, quietly, without explanation. Willa Graves wasn't plain. She wasn't what he'd expected in any particular way. She was sharp at the jaw, careful with her eyes, dressed in charcoal wool that had seen better days but was mended well and mended often. She scanned the street the way someone does when they've learned that exits matter. When her gaze landed on him, she didn't smile. "You're Nathaniel Croft," she said. Not a question. "That's right." She walked toward him without waiting to be met halfway. "Willa Graves, I read your notice twice before I answered it. I wanted to make sure I understood what you meant." "And did you?" "You meant it literally." She looked at the wagon behind him. "Good. So did I." The drive out to the ranch was 40 minutes in cold that crept under everything. Willa sat beside him on the bench and said almost nothing. She watched the land, and when they crossed the ridge and the valley opened below, the spruce trees dark against white fields, the old ranch house anchored against the hill like it had grown there, she leaned forward slightly, just enough for him to notice. "How many acres?" she asked. 620. Most of it pasture. Some timber to the north I don't touch. "And you run it alone?" "Since my father died." 3 years. She didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that. Inside, the house was warm and sparse. He'd cleaned before going to town. It still had the particular emptiness of a place where one person moved through the same routines for too long. Willa set her satchel down beside the door and looked around the way she'd looked at the land. Cataloging. "Spare room?" she asked. "Through there." He nodded to the door on the left. "I cleared it out last week." She pushed it open, looked in, nodded once. "This is fine." She didn't touch the walls or the furniture. She set her trunk at the foot of the narrow bed and kept the satchel on the floor beside her pillow, close enough to reach in the dark. Nathaniel noticed that. He didn't mention it. Dinner was soup he'd made the night before, and bread from the widow down the road. They ate across from each other at the kitchen table. The fire popped. Outside, the wind pushed at the windows. "I can cook," Willa said, not looking up from her bowl. "You don't have to. We have an arrangement. I'll carry my part of it." She dipped her bread. "Starting tomorrow. All right." She looked up then. Something in her face had settled slightly, like a knot letting out one degree of tension. "I'll need to know how things work here. The accounts, the suppliers, the routines. I learn fast. I'll show you whatever you want to see." She nodded and went back to her soup. He tried to read something in the stillness of her but couldn't. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't performing calm either. She was simply contained, like a woman who'd learned to take up the exact amount of space she needed, and no more. After she went to bed, he sat by the fire and stared at it and thought about what he'd gotten himself into. The next morning she was in the kitchen before him, coffee on, eggs in the pan, the account ledger open on the table beside her. When he appeared in the doorway, she didn't look up from the page. "You're being undercharged on your hay delivery and overcharged on your grain," she said. Not by much, but consistently. He poured himself coffee and stood behind her shoulder. She'd made small, neat notes in pencil beside 3 months of entries. The numbers were right. He'd been sloppy with it, distracted by everything else, telling himself he'd look closer when things slowed down. "That's McAllister's feed," he said. "He's been my supplier for 6 years. It's his son who runs the deliveries now." Nathaniel looked at the notations again. $2 here, $4 there. Nothing that would catch your eye in a single week. But it added up. "You found this in one morning?" Willa turned in her chair. Her expression was even. "I was raised to watch numbers. My father believed it was the one skill he could give me that no one could take away." A pause. He was wrong about a lot of things. He was right about that. They drove into Hartley Creek that afternoon. Willa sat straight in the wagon with the ledger in her lap. At McAllister's, young Derek McAllister greeted them with the easy confidence of a man who'd never been caught. Willa set the ledger on the counter and opened it to her first notation, September. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She walked him through it entry by entry, calm and exact, and by the time she reached November, Derek's face had gone the color of old snow. "I'd like the difference returned," she said. "That's $112 across 6 months. We'll accept 100 even and call it an accounting error. If you prefer, we can also involve the magistrate." Derek counted the money out with shaking hands. Nathaniel stood beside Willa and said nothing because there was nothing for him to say. She had it. In the wagon on the way home, he looked at her sideways. "You enjoyed that?" "Yes." She didn't pretend otherwise. "I don't apologize for it. I'm not asking you to." A pause. Then, something like the beginning of a smile. It was that evening, when they'd come back from town and were sitting with tea by the fire, that Nathaniel saw the man. He'd gone out to check the horses and noticed a figure standing near the edge of the road, up past the gate, just standing, watching the house. When he went in and mentioned it, Willa went still in a way he hadn't seen before, different from her usual stillness. This was something else. What did he look like, she asked. Tall. Well-dressed. Out of place. She set her cup down carefully. Did he have a gray coat? High collar? He did. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she was looking at the fire. "That's Caldwell," she said quietly. "He works for my brother." Her brother's name was Gareth Graves. She told Nathaniel about him that night, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low, her hands flat on the table in front of her, like she was steadying herself against the telling of it. Gareth Graves was 41 years old and had spent the last decade building a property development company in Edmonton on the strength of their father's inheritance and connections their mother had left behind when she died. He was respected in the right rooms. He had a lawyer, a member of the provincial legislature, and a judge from Calgary in his pocket. Willa had been their father's bookkeeper from the time she was 17. When their father died 2 years ago, the will left the family business shared equally between the two of them. Gareth had expected her to sign her portion over quietly. When she didn't, when she found the discrepancies in the estate accounts and realized Gareth had been redirecting funds for years, he'd offered her money to stay silent. When she refused that, he'd threatened her. "He told me I was confused," she said. "That grief was making me see things that weren't there. He had a doctor at the house inside a week, a friend of his, who wrote a letter saying I was suffering from nervous exhaustion and poor judgment." Nathaniel listened without moving. After that, he petitioned to have my share of the estate held in trust until I was deemed competent to manage it. He controls the trust. She looked at her hands. "I had 2 weeks before the hearing. I took what I could carry, my mother's letters, the account records I'd copied, and I left. And ended up here. You notice was in a newspaper someone left at a hotel in Red Deer. It seemed like the furthest thing from what I was running from." She looked up at him. "I didn't tell you any of this before I came. I understand if that changes your answer." Nathaniel thought about the quiet he'd wanted, the uncomplicated arrangement, the woman who wouldn't bring complications onto his land. "It doesn't," he said. Her expression shifted. Not relief exactly, more like the careful surprise of someone who's had too many floors give out underneath them to trust solid ground immediately. "Caldwell won't stop," she said. "My brother will send him back. He'll come to the ranch. Then he'll find you married and living somewhere he can't reach you." She stared at him. "You'd do that. You'd actually file the papers. You came here to build something that would hold. I said I'd be part of that." He met her eyes. "I meant it." They filed the marriage registration at the Hartley Creek courthouse 2 days later. Justice Arnett married them in his office above the post office with his clerk and the woman from the hardware store serving as witnesses. The whole of it took 12 minutes. Willa signed her full name in the register. Willa Annette Graves, in small, precise handwriting. Nathaniel signed beside it. Walking back to the wagon, she touched the plain gold band he'd bought that morning at the jeweler on Main Street. "I never imagined this," she said. Not sad about it, just naming a fact. Neither did I. We barely know each other. We know enough. He helped her up onto the bench. The rest we'll figure out. 3 days later, Gareth Graves arrived. Nathaniel was mending the fence along the east pasture when he heard Willa's voice carry from the yard. Sharp, controlled, he set down the wire pliers and walked back. Gareth was on horseback at the edge of the yard, Caldwell a few steps behind him. He was a broad-shouldered man in an expensive coat who'd learned to carry himself the way money teaches you. Like space was his to occupy by right. When Nathaniel came around the corner of the barn, Gareth glanced at him with the particular expression of a man assessing a problem. "This is the arrangement, is it?" Gareth said. He wasn't speaking to Nathaniel. "I'm married," Willa said, "and I'm staying here. You've had a long ride for nothing. You're not well, Willa. That's what this is about. You fled your home, married a stranger, and you're living on a failing ranch in the middle of nowhere. That's not the behavior of someone thinking clearly." "The ranch isn't failing," Willa said, "and you know the rest isn't true. The courts won't agree with you. I've already filed an extension on the competency petition. There's a hearing set in Calgary in 3 weeks. His voice dropped to something almost kind, which was worse. "Come home, let this go. We can sort out the estate questions privately, between family." The estate questions. Willa's voice was so level it barely sounded like anger. "That's what you're calling the $140,000 you moved out of accounts before the will was probated." Something shifted in Gareth's expression. "You don't know what you're talking about. I copied the records before I left." She didn't look away from him. "Every transaction, every date. I have them." A long silence. Caldwell's horse shifted under him. Nathaniel stood beside Willa, not in front of her, not blocking her, but beside her, and let the silence run. "You'll lose the hearing," Gareth said finally. "Maybe," Willa said, "but I'll show up for it." Gareth looked at Nathaniel for the first time with direct attention. "You understand what you've stepped into." "I understand she's my wife. That's enough." "It won't be." He turned his horse and rode back down the road, Caldwell behind him, neither of them hurrying. Willa watched until they were gone. Then she let out a breath that had probably been held since before Nathaniel came around the barn. "He meant all of it," she said. "I know. He has 3 lawyers and a judge who owes him a favor. We have." She stopped. "Looked at Nathaniel, each other," he said, "and whatever we can build from here." That night she spread the copied records across the kitchen table. Pages of them, careful handwriting, the numbers she'd preserved and carried across 2 provinces. Nathaniel looked at them with her and felt something clarify in his understanding of who she was. She hadn't run from weakness. She'd run from a trap set by someone with more institutional power, and she'd taken the evidence with her on the way out. "We need a lawyer," he said. "I know. Do you know anyone?" She was quiet. "There was a woman at the Law Society in Edmonton. Ruth Adler. She'd just passed the bar when I was still working for my father. My brother tried to have her blocked from taking the exam. Said women-in-law made a mockery of the profession." A small pause. "She passed anyway. Top marks. Would she take this case?" "She hates my brother." Willa looked up. That might be enough. She wrote the letter that night. They posted it the next morning. While they waited, they worked. The ranch ran better with 2 of them. Willa reorganized the supply schedule, renegotiated the hay contract, and set up a proper ledger system that showed, clearly, that the operation was not failing. It had just been undermanaged, the way things get when one person carries too much alone. Nathaniel fixed fences, moved cattle, did what he knew. They filled in each other's gaps without discussing it. Caldwell came back twice. Once to the gate, once into town when Nathaniel had gone for supplies. Willa had seen him watching the house from the road. She'd gone inside and loaded the shotgun. She didn't fire it. She didn't need to. But she was ready, and Nathaniel understood when he came home that she'd always been ready in ways he was only beginning to see. The letter from Ruth Adler arrived 11 days later. It was 2 sentences. "I know who your brother is. Meet me in Calgary." Ruth Adler's office was on the third floor of a building on Stephen Avenue that smelled like wood smoke and old paper. She was 32, small, with close-cropped dark hair and the directness of someone who'd spent years having to be twice as clear as anyone else just to be heard at all. She listened to everything without interrupting. When Willa finished, Ruth picked up her pen. "Show me the records." Willa laid them out. Ruth read for 20 minutes. Nathaniel and Willa said nothing. "This is fraud," Ruth said finally. "Clear and documented. Can we prove it in court?" Willa asked. "Proving it and winning are different things. Your brother has a judge. He has the competency petition filed first, which means the hearing deals with your ability to manage your own affairs before it can deal with anything else." Ruth set the papers down. "If they declare you incompetent, the financial fraud becomes moot. You'd have no legal standing to pursue it. So we fight the competency hearing first. Ruth looked at her steadily. "What they'll argue is that you're unstable, that you fled under emotional distress, made rash decisions, married impulsively. They'll paint a picture of a woman coming apart." "What do we argue?" "That a woman who copied 100 pages of financial records before she left, who traveled across 2 provinces under her own power, who found employment, negotiated contracts, corrected vendor fraud, and made a rational legal decision to protect herself through marriage." Ruth paused. "Is not a woman coming apart. She's a woman who saw clearly and acted." Willa was very still. "You think that works. I think it's the truth, and truth handled properly can work." Ruth picked up her pen again. "I won't tell you the odds are good. Gareth Graves has spent money building this case. We have 3 weeks. But I'll tell you this. I've been waiting 3 years for a case that goes at your brother. If you're in, I'm in." They prepared. Ruth worked them hard, harder than either of them had expected. She drilled Willa on every detail of the financial records, on the timeline of events, on how to speak about her father's death and Gareth's actions, without sounding either fragile or bitter. She told Willa to tell the truth, clearly, and let the court find the emotion in the facts rather than performing it. She questioned Nathaniel just as thoroughly. "They'll call you an opportunist," she said, across the table from him in the hotel room they'd rented 2 days before the hearing, "a man who took advantage of a woman in distress. That's the story they'll try to build." "It's not true." "Then we build the counter. Why did you answer her response to your notice? What made you stand with her instead of taking the money?" He thought about how to put it. "She walked into my house and handled things I'd been letting sit for 3 years. Not because I was paying her. Because she saw what needed doing and did it." He met Ruth's eyes, and when her brother showed up, trying to drag her back, "I thought, what kind of man watches that happen and does nothing?" Ruth wrote something down. "That's good. Say exactly that." The hearing was in the Federal Building on a gray Thursday morning. Gareth's legal team filled one table. 3 lawyers, a court clerk, a stack of documents that reached nearly to the lamp. Ruth sat beside Willa at the other table. Nathaniel sat directly behind, close enough to touch her shoulder if she needed it. Judge Emmett Briggs was a compact man in his 60s with the careful stillness of someone who'd learned to give nothing away. He'd known Gareth Graves socially for 8 years, according to Ruth's research. That was the hill in front of them. Gareth's lead lawyer, Sullivan Cade, was polished and unhurried, the kind of man who'd learned that confidence was its own form of argument. He opened by laying the framework quietly. A troubled young woman, a grief-stricken daughter who'd found after her father's death that the world was more complicated than she'd understood. A brother who only wanted to protect her from the consequences of poor decisions made in emotional fog. He produced 3 affidavits from physicians, none of whom had met Willa, all of whom used phrases like presented indicators of anxiety-driven impulsivity and emotionally compromised judgment pattern. Ruth objected to each, and Judge Briggs sustained 2 of them, which was more than she'd expected. When Willa took the stand, she was calm in the way. Water is calm before it runs fast. Ruth walked her through it step by step. The accounts she'd managed since 17. The anomalies she'd found. Dates, amounts, names of accounts where funds had moved. The night she'd left, the records she'd taken. "Why did you copy the records before you left?" Ruth asked. Willa's hands were steady on the edge of the witness box. "Because I knew that if I left without them, they'd disappear. And because if I was going to be called irrational, I wanted the evidence to speak for itself. Sullivan Cade came at her. He was good, precise and pleasant in a way that was harder to resist than outright hostility. "Miss Graves." "Mrs. Croft," Willa said. "Mrs. Croft," a brief smile. "You've testified that you copied 114 pages of financial documents. Over how long a period?" "4 evenings. After my brother had gone to bed. Covert activity. In secret. Careful activity. Under threat." "You felt threatened?" "My brother had already had me assessed by a physician he hired. He'd already told me that if I didn't agree to his terms, he would have my portion of the estate held in trust indefinitely. Yes, I felt threatened because I was threatened. Or you were frightened and interpreting reasonable actions as threatening because you were not well. A reasonable action would have been to discuss the accounting concerns openly." He refused 3 requests for that conversation. Cade pivoted. "You married a man you'd known for less than a week." "I married a man whose character I'd observed at close range, how he managed his land, his workers, his word. I made a legal decision in my own interest using the information I had. That's not impulsivity, that's judgment." Cade smiled again. "Mrs. Croft, is it possible that fear impaired your judgment in ways you're not fully aware of?" Willa looked at him steadily. "That's possible for anyone. The question is whether the actions themselves were rational. I'd ask you to judge the actions." Ruth hadn't prompted her to say that. Nathaniel saw Judge Briggs look up. When Nathaniel took the stand, Cade came after him, efficient and cold. "Mr. Croft, your ranch has been operating at a loss for 2 years. It had been undermanaged. My wife corrected that within the first month. Your wife, who arrived at your property after answering a newspaper advertisement, who you married within days of her arrival, who showed me exactly what was in my accounts, renegotiated my supply contracts, and recovered money I'd been losing for 6 months to a dishonest delivery man." Nathaniel's voice was even. "I'd call that sound judgment on her part and good fortune on mine. Or desperation on her part and opportunity on yours. Ask anyone in Hartley Creek who's seen us work together what they see." Cade withdrew it, but the suggestion hung in the air. Nathaniel watched Willa from the witness stand and thought about the satchel she kept by her bed. About the way she'd stood in the yard when Gareth came, steady as anything, carrying a year's worth of fear and not letting it move her. He thought about the evenings she'd sat across from him and laid out her whole history, every piece of it, like she was handing him something fragile and waiting to see if he'd drop it. He hadn't dropped it. When Ruth stood for her closing, she didn't dramatize. She laid it out plain. The medical evaluations were written by doctors who had never met Willa Graves. They were based entirely on accounts provided by a man who had a direct financial interest in the outcome of this hearing. No independent physician had found any basis for a declaration of incompetency. The actions Willa had taken, leaving, copying records, traveling, seeking employment, entering a legal marriage, were all the actions of a person in possession of her judgment. Every single one of them served a clear purpose. Ruth picked up the copied records and set them on the edge of the table where Briggs could see them. "The real question before the court," she said, "was not whether Willa Croft was competent. The evidence was clear that she was. The real question was whether a woman's decision to refuse her brother's terms could be treated as evidence of mental illness, and whether this court was prepared to establish that precedent." Judge Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would take the matter under consideration overnight. They walked out into the late afternoon. The air was cold and sharp off the river. "He's going to rule against us," Willa said. "Not as despair. As a calculation." Ruth pulled her coat tighter. "He might. Briggs is careful. He doesn't like ruling without certainty." She paused. "And we gave him more than Gareth's team expected. Was it enough? I don't know." They found a small restaurant on a side street and ate dinner quietly. Nathaniel ordered coffee and let it go cold. Willa ate steadily, the way she did most things. Without waste, without performance. She caught him watching. "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are. I just mean you don't have to watch me for signs of distress." "I'm not." He turned his cup. "I'm watching because I've spent 3 years not having anyone to eat dinner with." She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Just briefly. Then she went back to her food. That was enough. Morning came too fast and stayed cold. They walked to the courthouse in gray light. Ruth slightly ahead, Willa beside Nathaniel. He could feel the steadiness she was maintaining and understood what it cost. Judge Briggs came in, settled himself, and read from a page of notes without preamble. He found the medical evaluations methodologically inadequate. He found the testimony of both Mrs. Croft and Mr. Croft credible and consistent. He found no evidence of impaired judgment, emotional instability, or incapacity for rational decision-making. He found, in fact, substantial evidence to the contrary. The petition for declaration of incompetency was dismissed. He also noted, before adjourning, that the financial records entered into evidence raised questions that fell outside the scope of this hearing, but would be appropriate for further investigation by the relevant authorities. Gareth across the aisle was very still. Cade was already leaning toward him, speaking quietly. But what Nathaniel was watching was Willa, who had both hands flat on the table and was staring straight ahead, breathing. He put his hand over hers the way she'd done for him at dinner. She didn't cry. She turned and looked at him instead, with something open in her face that he hadn't seen before. They took the afternoon train back to Hartley Creek. Ruth came with them as far as Edmonton, where she had another matter waiting. Before she boarded her connection, she took Willa's hand. The financial investigation will take time, she said. Your brother has resources. Don't expect it to move fast. I know, but it will move. Ruth said it like a fact. Those records don't lie, and you kept them well. Willa nodded. Thank you for this. Don't thank me. Ruth's expression shifted into something almost warm. Just build something worth protecting. 2 months passed, then 3. The ranch moved through the deep winter, the kind that comes down off the Rockies and makes every day feel like a battle with the cold. They broke ice in the water troughs at dawn, fed the cattle in wind that cut through every layer, watched the snow come down and the land go still and white and enormous all the way to the mountains. They worked. They argued sometimes about how much to spend on repairs, about whether to expand the herd in spring, about the proper way to manage the north fence that kept pulling loose in the frost heaves. Willa was right more often than he was, and didn't pretend otherwise. He appreciated that. He was more patient with the physical work than she was, and she came to appreciate that too. The satchel stayed by her bed, but after a while Nathaniel noticed she stopped checking that it was there every morning. It was still there. She simply stopped needing to verify it. In February, a letter arrived from the provincial attorney's office. An inquiry had been opened into the management of the Graves estate. Willa read it at the kitchen table and set it down carefully. It started, she said. How do you feel? She thought about it honestly, the way she did most things, like it's been a very long year, and like I'm tired of being afraid something will take this away. She looked around the kitchen, the ledger on the counter, the coffee on the stove, the window with its view of the snow-covered yard. I want to stop waiting for the next thing. Then stop, he said. It's not nothing you're waiting for, it's just the life that's already here. She looked at him. You've gotten unexpectedly philosophical. You've been a good influence. She laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and it changed the room. They didn't talk about what they were becoming for a long time. They didn't need to. The marriage had started as a legal instrument and become something else the way things do. When two people work alongside each other through enough hard days, by the time either of them could have named it, they'd already been living it for months. On a Sunday evening in March, when the snow was finally starting to thin on the south-facing slopes, Willa was going through her mother's letters at the kitchen table. She'd been doing that more lately, reading them, sometimes reading pieces aloud to Nathaniel when he was nearby, reconstructing a woman she'd lost too young. He'd asked her once about her mother, and she'd said she was quiet and good with numbers, and had taught Willa that skill deliberately, on purpose, because she understood it was something no one could take from her. Nathaniel thought about his own father, who had built this ranch with bad knees and no help, and left it to him like a gift he'd almost failed to deserve. My mother would have liked it here, Willa said. Not melancholy, just a thing she was saying out loud. What makes you think so? She liked places where the land was bigger than the problems. She folded the letter back into its envelope. She would have liked you, too. She appreciated people who were honest about what they couldn't do. He looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning low. Outside, something moved in the dark. Just an animal, a deer probably, crossing the yard. I love you, she said. She said it the way she said most things. Directly, without cushioning it or waiting to see how he'd take it. He felt it settle into him like something that had always been true and was only now being named. I love you too. She nodded as though they'd just agreed on a supply contract, and then she smiled, slow and real, and went back to her letters. In April, Gareth Graves was formally charged with fraudulent mismanagement of a deceased's estate. His lawyers negotiated. The process would take time. Ruth wrote to say it would likely take 2 years and a good outcome was probable but not guaranteed. Willa wrote back and said she understood, and thank you, and please let her know when she needed to give testimony. Then she put the letter in the file drawer and went outside to help Nathaniel move the cattle to the spring pasture. The grass was coming up green in the low places where the melt had run. The cattle were restless and glad for the move. The two of them worked the gate, moved the herd through in manageable groups, walked the fence line after to check for winter damage. Willa crouched at a section of sagging wire and assessed it with the same expression she used for a column of numbers that wasn't adding right. We'll need new posts here, she said. 6 of them, minimum. I know. I've been putting it off. I've noticed. She straightened. I've also noticed you put things off when you're managing too much alone. You don't have to do that anymore. He looked at her in the afternoon light, mud on her boots, hair coming loose from its braid, completely at home in this landscape that had swallowed his loneliness for 3 years. I know, he said. I'm still learning. So am I. She came and stood beside him to look at the fence. We'll order the posts this week. The mountains were still white at the top, but the valley was thawing. The air smelled like cold water and new grass. Around them, the herd spread out across the pasture, easy and content, doing what cattle do when the winter finally ends and there's room again to move. Nathaniel Croft had put an advertisement in a general store window asking for simple, and received Willa Graves instead. Complicated and clear-eyed and carrying evidence that could bring a powerful man down. He'd expected an arrangement. He'd ended up with a partner. She'd answered a stranger's notice looking for distance and found a home that no one could take from her. Because she'd helped build it herself, with her own hands and her own mind, and she'd chosen it every day with full knowledge of what it cost. That made it hers in a way nothing her brother could do in a courtroom would ever touch. They walked back to the house together as the sun lowered behind the ridge, the long Alberta evening stretching gold across the snowmelt fields. 2 people who'd needed something different from what they'd asked for, and had been honest enough to accept what they'd found.